Proft. I'm a talk show host on WLS. I ran for governor back in 2010. Some of you may remember, some of you may not, one of our campaigns. But the real conversation that I wanted to have with you tonight is about the storytelling function of conservatives in Illinois. Why we are losing races, particularly statewide races, that we should win. Why we are not making the progress we could make in terms of gaining control of the General Assembly, which is mission critical. The reality is that until and unless Mike Madigan is removed from power, removed as Speaker of the Illinois House, nothing will improve in Illinois. So whether you think that we can win the net 6 seats that we need to take out Mike Madigan, or you don't, you have to believe that if you believe that anything is ever going to improve in this state prior to us going into receivership or being sold off for parts, because he is the bulwark against progress in Illinois. And the great thing that happened in 2010, despite the fact that we did not make as much progress as all of our Midwestern neighbors at the state level, federal level we made progress. We rode the wave that a lot of our other Midwestern neighbors did in picking up 4 congressional seats and picking up a Senate seat and helping Republicans regain control of the House at the federal level. State level, not so much. But the good thing that happened is that our neighbors, Republicans in other states, took away a crutch that we've been leaning on, took away a rationalization. And that rationalization, that crutch is, you can't do anything in Illinois because of Chicago. You can't win in this state because of Chicago. Well, 2 things. One is Chicago and Cook County have been part of Illinois for some time, like 175 years, and we have won races during that time period. So that's number 1. Oh, and by the way, Chicago is at its smallest population since 1920, so it should be getting easier, not more difficult. The second thing is that states with a much deeper and more robust progressive liberal tradition made incredible progress at the state level, starting with our neighbor to the north, Wisconsin. Right? In advance of the 2010 election cycle, very few people would have predicted that after 2010 we'd be talking about Governor Scott Walker and U.S. Senator Ron Johnson and Republican control, importantly, critically important, Republican control of their state legislature. And it wasn't just Wisconsin. It was Indiana. Mitch Daniels closed the deals that started when he first became governor, closed the deal, and they consolidated their control of the Indiana state legislature, and Iowa, Wisconsin, as I mentioned, and Michigan, and Minnesota, and Ohio, and on and on and on. But it didn't happen here. And so you have to kind of ask yourself, what is it that those other states are doing that we're not doing? Why are we not seizing the opportunity that is manifest? Because, frankly, Illinois is in the worst financial condition of any of those states. So that should breed more upside for us politically. The good news is that despite the missed opportunity in 2010 at the state level, the opportunity persists in 2012. Because, incredibly, things have actually gotten worse. In advance of the 2010 election cycle, we only had the 2nd worst state deficit per capita in the country. Now we have the worst. In advance of the 2010 cycle, we only had the 2nd lowest credit rating of any state in the nation. Now we have the lowest credit rating. So I guess that we could extend the margin between us in last place and the other states in 49th and 48th place on all these quality of life metrics. But I think the reality is that we have this opportunity in 2012 that persists, and if we don't take advantage of it and start moving the flag in a more substantive manner and start taking out some of the people that have lorded over the state and whose policy choices have destroyed the state's economy in very short order, then we are going to be wandering in the wilderness for another decade. We are going to be scratching our heads, just as we're scratching our heads after 2010, saying, how do these guys continue to escape the gallows? How do we lose continually to these mediocre intellects and street criminals from Chicago, in spite of all evidence and logic to the contrary? And I think it's the failure to be good storytellers and to control our vote. And when I say our vote, I mean you specifically. You specifically controlling the vote that you could exercise control of. And I was thinking about what we didn't do in 2010, after November of 2010, like most people were, especially losing the governor's race. And then David Mamet writes a book last summer. David Mamet, most of you probably know, great playwright, great screenwriter. I'm sure you've seen some of his movies or plays, Glengarry Glen Ross, The Verdict with Paul Newman, Wicked Son. He's got a great play, actually right now in Chicago, if you ever get to the big city, and you take out a loan from your local bank so you can afford the parking downtown. But there's a great play called Race, that's a Mamet play at the Goodman Theater in Chicago right now, which I highly recommend. My art critic hat. But Mamet's book last summer called The Secret Knowledge. And what Mamet did in his book, The Secret Knowledge, is chronicle his journey, not just his journey from starting out as a Chicago cab driver to being a Hollywood screenwriter who writes 7-figure screenplays for a living, but his journey specifically over the last 10 years as he went from a rank-and-file Hollywood leftist to, today, a conservative. And the reason The Secret Knowledge is such an entertaining read is because it provides testament to the old cliche that converts make the greatest zealots, because Mamet just torches Hollywood, so it's very, very entertaining to read that. But Mamet's journey, I think, has some application for us in Illinois. And it starts in advance of the 2000 presidential election. He's having a conversation with his rabbi after Saturday service, and he just says in passing, so, Rabbi, who are you going to vote for in November? You voting for Al Gore for president? And Mamet's rabbi said, actually, David, no, I'm not a Gore supporter. I'm not voting for Gore. Mamet said, oh, that's interesting. So you're voting for Ralph Nader. That's interesting. I wouldn't have pegged you as a Nader supporter. Because if you remember, in 2000, the choices were Nader or Gore, at least in that worldview, in that mindset. And Mamet's rabbi said, actually, no, I'm not supporting or voting for Ralph Nader either. And then Mamet started to kind of slowly do the math. So wait a second, are you saying what I think you're saying? Are you going to vote for George W. Bush? And Mamet's rabbi said, yeah, actually, David, I'm a Republican. I'm going to vote for George W. Bush. And the blood drained from Mamet's face, and he was immediately concerned about his rabbi's eternal salvation, as anyone would be. And he said, I don't know what's happened. I don't know how you veered off into the wilderness, but let me send you some books. I want to have you read those books. We'll discuss them, and then we'll bring you back into the fold, because I don't know how this has happened, but certainly my rabbi cannot be supporting George W. Bush. And so they did, and Mamet sent his rabbi the typical liberal tracts, What's Wrong with Kansas by Thomas Frank, and other Chinese propaganda tomes by Tom Friedman, and so forth. And they read those books and discussed them. And then Mamet's rabbi said to David, okay, we've read your scholarship, heard the arguments. Now, fair is fair, I'd like to send you some books, and I'd like for you to read these books, and let's discuss those in turn. And so Mamet, of course, assented, and Mamet's rabbi sent him books like Witness by Whittaker Chambers, Conflict of Visions by Thomas Sowell, Capitalism and Freedom by Milton Friedman, Road to Serfdom, The Law by Bastiat, others. And they discussed those. And as Mamet read those books and they discussed them, slowly but surely Mamet started to move, culminating with The Secret Knowledge 10 years later. 2 lessons. One is, because we are here on a Tuesday night and our neighbors and friends and family members and coworkers and colleagues are not, we believe sometimes we get into this bubble of believing that everyone is as engaged as we are, follows this stuff, follows current events and what's going on in the world as closely as we do. Everyone has heard all the arguments, they've read all the scholarship, and some people just choose command control over free markets. Some people just choose statism over liberty. When in point of fact, most people haven't heard the arguments. Most people haven't been exposed to the scholarship. David Mamet, pretty sharp guy, pretty intellectual guy, reads a lot, writes for a living, until his late 50s, had never been exposed to books that I read in high school and college. Don't assume people know what you know. Don't assume they've been exposed to the arguments that you have heard, the books that you have read. They haven't. They haven't. And they matter. Arguments matter. Words matter. I'm always amazed by people say, oh, it's just politicians' rhetoric. It's just words. Our founding documents, you know what those are? Just words. Just words on a piece of paper. Why are they important? Because they speak to who we are and who we aspire to be. So the words we choose, the arguments we make are very important. And the arguments and the scholarship that you expose people to is equally important. The second thing that I think is a takeaway that has application for us, everyone, conservatives across the nation, is what Mammoth's rabbi said about why he thought David would be open to conversion, in a sense, converting to believing in theory what he did in practice, which was to practice capitalism. Right? This is one of the great paradoxes of the left. They reject in theory what they do in practice. Right? So connecting those dots. And Mammoth's rabbi said, what the left tries to do is squash people, make you one-dimensional. You are your income tax bracket, and that's all you are. And he said, David is an artist. So any theory that attempted to explain the human condition, that treated individuals, that treated human beings as one-dimensional, he knew Mammoth would reject out of hand because he knows they're multidimensional or multifaceted. And that's precisely what happened. So the story that we have to tell, the arguments that we have to communicate to our friends and colleagues and coworkers and co-volunteers and so forth within our circles of influence. Because I think if you think about what's happened over the last decade in particular in Illinois and the failure of the Republican Party to elect conservatives or for conservatives to beat Chicago Democrats, it is not a failure of money. Not really. I mean, last cycle, for example, Bill Brady actually had more money than that. It's not really a failure of manpower, especially with the advent of the Tea Party. The discrepancy in manpower between the left and the right has been significantly lessened. Now, yeah, the public sector unions and other labor unions can still probably on balance in most places bring more bodies to bear, but that's not dispositive of why we're losing races. The other thing I think is the key, is message. Who do we say we are? Who do we explicitly aim to represent? And what do we say we will do in furtherance of that representation? I think that is very poorly defined in the minds of the electorate. And I think they have a very difficult time distinguishing between Republicans and Democrats in this state. And I think that confusion is really detrimental to our electoral chances. So I have an idea about what I think the story should be that you share with your friends and neighbors and colleagues and coworkers, the people whose opinion, the people to whom your opinion matters, much more than mine. And if you don't like my story, it's fine. I'm not running for office. You're not going to hurt my feelings. But I would suggest that you come up with a story. Because if people don't know who we are, they are much more likely to fall back on past bad behavior. I'm a Democrat, not because I like Chicago Democrats, but because my granddad was a Democrat and my mom was a Democrat. And I know I don't recognize the Democrat Party either, but I don't know who Republicans are. It happens all over this state. And when you lose a governor's race by 20,000 votes, there's 10 times that number of votes that were left on the table because we didn't make an appeal to people that have rejected the Chicago Democrats but are yet unwilling to embrace an alternative because they don't understand what the alternative is specifically. So my story. I've noticed since the largest tax increase in Illinois history was passed last January, happy anniversary, that there's big employers in this state that have political sway. That when they speak, they make headlines. That even Chicago Democrats will listen to when they call. The Caterpillars and the John Deeres and the Motorola Mobilities and the Sears and the CME Group. When they start to say to the political class that, you know what, don't know if you've noticed, we live in a digital global world. We don't have to be in Illinois. We can invest elsewhere. We can locate elsewhere. We can offshore. We're not real excited to pay this corporate tax increase. And they get special deals, which is what happened. And I understand. I don't blame the leadership of those companies. They have to be sensitive to a bottom line. They're trying to protect their company, their employees, make their company as profitable as they can. I get it. But there are another group of businesses in the state whose phone calls do not get returned, who are not in line for proportional tax relief. And those are the 1.1 million businesses in this state with fewer than 5 employees. 1.1 million businesses with fewer than 5 employees. The owner-operators, the entrepreneurial class that we as a Republican Party or we as conservatives and Tea Party members spend a lot of time talking about as the real wealth producers, as the real job creators. Guess who doesn't understand that? Most of those 1.1 million owner-operator businesses. You know how I know they don't understand that our interests are aligned with them, or at least a lot of them don't understand that? Because if we had that as our sole constituency, we could all go home. Because we would win every statewide election going away. 1.1 million small businesses, representing 90% of all business enterprise in the state, and the multiplier effect of the employees of those businesses, it's monstrous. We haven't closed the deal with them. They haven't heard our arguments. They don't know who we are. Another example, teachers. I spent a lot of time on my little radio show beating the tar out of the teachers' unions in this state. And the reason I do that is because they deserve it. So I will continue to do that because they are destroying K-12 education in Illinois. And this is not an attack on teachers. I get this even in Republican crowds. It's always amazing to me. Is there anybody who is anti-teacher? It is tantamount to being anti-child. Nobody is anti-teacher. Nobody is anti-child. Let's just dispense with the false moral indignation and have an honest conversation that starts from the premise that nobody gets a blank check. Nowhere in the Constitution, nowhere in the Bible do I ever remember reading that certain groups of people or certain professions get a blank check at the expense of other people. So if you start from that premise, then it's a conversation about what we can afford, what is respectful and responsible to professionals in chosen pursuits, and what is respectful and responsible to the people financing those professions. But here's something else that's happening in education. 50% of teachers are leaving the profession within the first 5 years, which is a pretty substantial attrition rate in a profession that pays above median wages and benefits. And if you talk to teachers who've left the profession, they will invariably tell you that it wasn't pecuniary interest that drove them to other professions. It was that they were in school systems that did not allow them to do what they got into teaching to do, which is instill a love of learning into children, which is set children on a path to be successful, intellectually curious, independent adults. That these school systems were confiscatory. And here's what happens when young people who are talented find themselves in systems that are smothering, that don't deliver what they promised to deliver. They go do something else. And so that's what's happening. And our K-12 education, our K-12 school systems around this state are suffering as a result. Chicago may be one of the worst school systems in the Western Hemisphere, and it is. But there are a lot of mediocre school districts in this state, in the suburbs and the exurbs in central and southern Illinois, masquerading as great school districts, living off past glory that they no longer deserve, that they no longer can provide the evidence that they merit such an appellation. And the evidence of this, much like small businesses, you kind of reverse engineer it to understand what's happening. Talk to any community college or any university president in this state, and they will tell you that they are, and we are collectively, spending hundreds of millions of dollars in remediation for the 1 in 3 college-bound high school seniors that will go on to post-secondary education, because that small percentage of students that are actually going on to community college, going on to university, are not prepared to do post-secondary work. So we're paying for their high school education twice. And those are the best students. What about the other 2/3? What are their prospects? How prepared are they for the world in which we live today? teachers being driven from a profession they are good at, and that they got into the profession for the right reason, and they want to pursue. That is a constituency opportunity. It is not one that is going to be taken advantage of by Chicago Democrats who are beholden to the teachers' unions. It could be a constituency opportunity for conservatives, for the Illinois Republican Party, if we make that explicit appeal. Another example, trade union households. Public sector unions, different animal. But operating engineers and plumbers and carpenters and electricians, mugged by the reality of Chicago Democrat rule, sitting in union halls around this state with 25 and 30 and 35% out of work lists and have been there for 18, 24 months. Here's what Jimmy Hoffa Jr. and Barack Obama don't want you to know. Trade union households, Tea Party households, social conservatives, economic conservatives. They believe in American exceptionalism, and I mean American exceptionalism in the definition of that phrase, not in the Obama bastardization of the phrase where we're exceptional just the way New Zealand thinks they're exceptional. I mean that these households, these families believe in America. They believe in opportunity. They believe in working hard to provide for their family, and they will do precisely that if given that opportunity. Now, we may have some disagreements on particular labor laws, but they don't have any idea how closely aligned our interests actually are with their economic interests, because we haven't made an explicit appeal, because we haven't told them who we are, so we've let the other side tell them who we are. Last example, and if you remember nothing else from my talk this evening, please remember this statistic and share it liberally. It is the only thing I want you to do liberally. And that is that Illinois is 51st out of 50. For those of you who passed grade school geography, as I did, you know there are only 50 states, but we are also behind the District of Columbia when it comes to providing services to the developmentally disabled. When I came upon this HHS study, I was stunned a little bit. I had to kind of think about this, because I hear what Chicago Democrats say. I hear what those in control of this state say. And they say that they are the party of the truly vulnerable. They are the social safety net party. They will make sure that persons who, through no fault of their own, require state services are provided those state services, because that's what you do in a civilized society. And I agree with them. So here's the rub. That's your constituency, you have to explain something to them. We have $30 billion in bond debt. We have, as I mentioned before, the highest state deficit per capita and the lowest credit rating. We have upwards of $200 billion in unfunded public pension and health care liabilities. We passed a $7 billion tax increase last year, and yet the amount of our unpaid bills went up, eclipsing $8 billion. So, after all of that taxing and spending, and borrowing and spending, if the truly vulnerable were a core constituency that you were hell-bent to serve, how could it be possible that we are 51st out of 50 in serving that constituency? Those two things are not congruent. It's a riddle. And I thought about this for a while, and then it hit me. You know what explains this riddle? You know how you reconcile these two conflicting ideas? Democrats are lying. Revelatory, I know. They're lying. But do you know how many people outside of this room and other rooms I've spoken in know that number, know that story? How many people within your circles of influence? I'd submit not very many. And the reason people should know that statistic and that story is because of what David Mamet's rabbi said. This is not just about marginal tax rates. We are not here simply to save you another $500 on your state income tax next year. There are bigger issues. And to me, that statistic and the scam that Chicago Democrats have run on this state and the truly vulnerable among us speaks to how barbaric we have become as a state. Barbaric. That's the word. Uncivilized. You have families in this state with a developmentally disabled family member fleeing this state, just as businesses are for states that are more civilized. So when you think about that Burkean contract that we are all called on to abide between our ancestors who left this state for us, and between and with our progeny who come after us and what they will inherit, are we abiding that Burkean contract? Is that the legacy that you want to leave, that you are part of allowing this to happen? It's not what I want to leave. But the reality is we have to look in the mirror and say, because we have allowed Chicago Democrats to be their brothers, their public sector union brothers, sugar daddy, we have failed to be our brother's keeper. That's the reality. I mean, it's just the numbers are the numbers are the numbers. And if you think about those constituencies that I just rattled off, small businesses not aligned for tax relief, teachers being driven from a profession they're pretty good at, and lessening the quality of our schools as a result of their departure. The trade union households mugged by Chicago Democrat rule because of lessened economic opportunities, lessened work opportunities, and families with a developmentally disabled family member who are not getting those services that should be provided in a civilized society. There's a thread that ties those constituencies together. They have all been treated like less than by state government day findings, every single one of them. The more thans, the one percenters, to use some common parlance in Illinois, very easy to identify. There are the half a dozen Chicago Democrats who live within about 5 square miles of me in the city, and the public sector unions who finance them, and who they in return finance when they get elected. That's who state government is set up to serve, and it's serving them very well. When I ran for governor, I said, you know, you have to look at Illinois a little bit differently to understand what's going on. Because you have to, well, I think you have to start from the premise that Mike Madigan's not an idiot, that he hasn't been speaker for 3 decades and in the General Assembly for 4 because he doesn't know what he's doing. So if you believe he knows what he's doing, then it necessarily logically follows that state government must be producing what he wants it to produce. It's very difficult for people to ascribe bad motivations to other people. But the logic is pretty ironclad. Illinois isn't broken, it's fixed. The fix is in on behalf of the people in charge and the constituencies they serve, and against people who finance a state government that scams them, because there's only so much largesse to go around. And so the challenge in this cycle, I think, is not for you to be rescued by some guy blathering on the radio. It's not for you guys to be delivered from on high by your local politicians, not exclusively. It's for you to tell a story about who you are and who we are as conservatives, and control your vote. If we don't tell the story about who we are, Mike Madigan is perfectly prepared and ready to do it. The problem is when he tells a story about us, we don't come off quite as well, and it doesn't work out quite as well for us in the end. So if you want to choose a different adventure than the one we've been on for at least the last decade, and frankly, the last 3 decades, then you have got to control your vote. Think about what happened in the 2010 election cycle at the federal level. 2008, Barack Obama was elected president. Magazine cover stories were all Keynesians now. The problem with the end of the Bush administration and the Great Recession was market failures and government not doing enough, and government needs to be more activist. It needs to protect people. And what you had is a bunch of conservatives, Tea Party candidates, run for Congress in 2010 saying, actually, it turns out that it wasn't government doing, that it wasn't not enough government. That wasn't the problem. That it's actually government trying to do too much. It's actually government spending too much. This idea that you can spend $31,000 per household and only take in $18,000 per household and repeat that 115 million times, the idea that that is scalable is nonsense. That's what's destroying this country. And so now freshman Republicans changed the conversation in the 2010 election cycle, about this time, or maybe even a little later in the summer, 2 years ago. They changed the conversation. It wasn't government as a solution, it was big government as a problem that is shrinking the citizen and crowding out private activity. And that changed conversation, changed people's behavior. Well, first it changed people's minds, and and then it ultimately changed their behavior. And you had a lot of people who voted for Barack Obama in 2008, voting for Republican candidates for Congress in 2010. Otherwise, we wouldn't have won the majority. Change the conversation, change people's minds, because you inform their otherwise fact-free views on the world. You change people's behavior on election day, different electoral outcomes, so you have different policymakers making different policy choices. And oh, by the way, how important has it been to have Republican control of the House over the last 2 years as a bulwark against everything the Democrats wanted to do, but were unable to do because they didn't control the House? How important was that? So it's the same thing here. And there will be intersection points that present themselves within your circles of influence that I have described. Because people will say, I agree with you. Madigan, Cullerton, the Chicago Democrats, the people in charge who have destroyed the state. I concede your point. And then they're going to say, what do you got? And the what do you got question is where we have been falling down as a movement and as a party in Illinois. So as you talk to friends and neighbors, as things heat up again over the summer with an eye towards November, not just for the presidency, but for what's happening in this state, or what's not happening in this state, as we are in the bottom 5 in almost every quality of life indicator, that intersection point is going to present itself, where you can get them on that continuum of informing their views, so they change their mind, so they change their behavior, so we get different outcomes in November, and we have different policymakers making different policy choices. When the intersection point presents itself, and it will, what are you going to say? Still, within the Republican Party, which is kind of everybody running around, sticking flags in the ground, saying, look over here, look at me, I'm the new Republican Party. Get behind me. And I would caution again against playing cult of personality politics. It's not the right thing to do, and we're not particularly good at it, and we're especially not good at it as compared to how good the Democrats are at playing cult of personality politics. So I would very much caution against that. But the larger issue of we need 6 seats net in the House, we need 6 seats net in the Senate. I think we can get those 6 seats in the House this time. I think the Senate is a tougher hill to climb, but I think we can make significant progress. But understand, this is not a one election cycle deal. This is about building capacity, and this is why I talk about controlling votes and spreading a story and starting to brand ourselves. This is a capacity building exercise that will continue in 14 when Quinn is up, when Sauk and Durbin is up. So we have a chance to win those statewide seats. And then really to put together a center-right governing coalition that we can stitch together and hold together over the next decade, because it will take that long to undo all of the damage that Chicago Democrats have done to the state over the preceding 3 decades. This is not a light switch. This is not going to happen in one cycle. It's not going to happen overnight on the policy agenda, even if we were able to sweep all the offices. So we need to be as kind of focused of purpose on the electoral as well as the policy fights ahead of us as the Democrats are, because you'll remember we held the House in Illinois for 2 short years, the Gingrich Revolution year. 1994, I was there. Mike Madigan took back we took back the House from Mike Madigan. He was not at all pleased by that. He came up with a novel approach in 1996 and took it right back, and we haven't smelled control of the House in the intervening 16 years. So the other side doesn't stop. They're not going to, oh, we lost, we give up. That is not what is going to happen. They will not relent, and we cannot relent if we want to undo what they're doing and to marginalize the negative policies that invariably emanate from their control.
Yeah, I got a question here. Go back years ago, we had what they call patronage in the state of here in Illinois.
Patronage, yes, I've heard something about this.
Anyway, back then, when it comes to election time for the governors, we had a lot of fire going. The Republicans would get out and work for their side. The Democrats would work for their side.
Right.
And we had interesting elections.
Right.
And then they did away with that. At least the Republicans did. So as the Democrats went on with their corruption, it seems like to me, that they're still got patronage. But their patronage ain't, I'm going to give you a job, I'm going to give you a benefit. So now we're sitting out here sometime to vote over here. What do you offer me?
Right.
What they're saying to us, you know, what we got to come back with.
Well, you're right. I mean, we have the challenge of arguing a bit of an abstraction. We're going to offer you a lower tax bill, perhaps. We're going to offer you an opportunity to have your children actually stay in Illinois when they go off to school, or after they go off to school, or when they go to work, because right now they're not. So if you want to stay on this trajectory, this state, and you can't sell your home because, in part because of what they've done, so you're landlocked here, how bad do you want it to be? You know, I mean, and on the flip side, to your point, they're saying, yeah, I hear what they're saying, oh, good government, blah, 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 but how about this? How about this job? How about this contract? So it's a lot easier to sell, I've got this thing here to give you that's tangible and means money in your pocket or a job for life than it is to sell an abstraction. But I think we're past the point where this is compelling enough to a large enough number of people, because we have the makers and the takers, and there are still more makers in this state, and all they get in the mail is not job opportunities, they get bills, and the bills are coming with bigger and bigger numbers, and those numbers will grow bigger still. So, and by the way, just in terms of the children, in terms of quality of life, and not falling into their argument about treating people as one-dimensional, it's just about your marginal tax rate, it's just about your property tax bill. Only New Jersey exports more of its college-bound high school seniors than Illinois. So, I mean, when I say your kids are going to grow up, they're going to leave Illinois, and they're not coming back. So you better decide where you think you're moving to if you want to be close to them. That's just data. That is happening. Because what happens when kids go off to college? They don't come back. And they're especially not coming back to a state that doesn't have jobs. Or kids who don't go to college, and they're living in a state that doesn't have jobs. They go where the jobs are. And they ain't here because we have a state government that is cannibalizing everything in its wake to finance a status quo that doesn't benefit you. It is a very small group of people who are living high in the hog at the expense of everybody else. And so I guess you get into this you're always going to have this problem of some people are offering me a job and you're just offering me kind of a better quality of life if these certain policies were pursued. Well, there are going to be some people that always take the shortcut and take the job. But I think there's not enough jobs to go around, there's not enough contracts to go around, and there are a lot of people getting hammered in a way they never thought possible. That kind of damage, and I don't mean to be cynical or craven about it, the kind of damage that's been done to working families in this state provides an opportunity to reach working families for us that we haven't had in a while. And we should take advantage of it to point them to a better way so that we can break this paradigm of Democrats and Republicans offering the same way of doing business. That's what we really need to break.
How do we gain inroads into Cook County if like Kinzinger won't run against Jesse Jr.? How do you get rid of Jesse Jr.?
Yeah, well...
Then he takes on Mandela, which you don't gain anything.
Well, I understand. The Jesse Jr. race, how do we get rid of him? I mean, hopefully... obviously, his constituency is not going to do that, but maybe the U.S. Attorney's Office will. One can hope. But look, it's not going to be unanimous. You know, there are going to be some Democrat seats. There are going to be some constituencies that are very hard to reach, where the marginal cost is so high to try and move numbers in a district like Jesse Jackson's or Bobby Rush's that it's just better spent elsewhere. It's not going to be 100%. We need 50% plus one. And that representation in the General Assembly to move a policy agenda. I mean, look at the narrow majorities that Wisconsin Republicans have, and look what they've done in a year. I mean, they've completely changed the landscape of that state, and they've completely changed the economic trajectory of that state. We don't need to take out everybody. I mean, I would certainly be happy if we could, but we just need to maximize the indigenous advantages we have in districts that are being represented by Democrats right now that frankly should be represented by Republicans. For the last 15 years since I've been around, Madigan has always been one step ahead of the Republican Party. While we're defending seats in conservative areas, Republican areas like DuPage, he's making inroads in suburban Cook that used to be Republican, and he flipped them. Or an outlier, like he's got one state representative up in McHenry County, which is a 65% Republican county, and this guy runs around masquerading as a conservative Democrat. And it doesn't matter if he's a conservative Democrat because he just aids and abets the agenda of Chicago Democrats. So I don't care what he does because he makes one vote that matters, and that's the vote for Mike Madigan for Speaker. And the Republican Party needs to do a better job of exposing the charlatans exposing the Trojan horses and articulating a story about who we are so that people can say, I get them because I've seen what they've done and I'm not enjoying it. Who are you? I go again, Coke and Pepsi. Coke, we wish we had the marketing budget of Coca-Cola. They spend about 80% of their marketing budget saying, Coca-Cola, good drink, refreshing, you should buy it. Coke is it, and other pithy slogans. About 20% of their budget goes to saying, Pepsi, not so good. We do the opposite. We spend 80%, maybe 90% of our time and energy saying Chicago Democrats suck. And everybody nods their head. And then the other 10 to 20% of our time we say we're not so bad. Not compelling. I've probably done 125 events, Tea Parties and Republican Party organization events over the last calendar year. I have yet to have somebody tell me or offer what's the alternative story for the Republican Party in terms of advancing our brand or the conservative movement, if you don't identify with the Republicans. What do you think it's been for the last 10 years? Does anybody have any idea? I get people counting ceiling tiles all the time. We haven't even contemplated that question as a movement and a party. It's amazing to me because I think that's what's fundamental to our failure. So I just want to encourage people. I don't pretend to have all the answers, but I do think there's a whole area of thought that we have left virgin, and we need to engage in this area of thought about who we are, who we want to represent, make an explicit appeal to those constituencies, and be explicit about what we will do in furtherance of their economic interests if we were given the chance to represent them.
Would you mind elaborating a little bit on those figures you cited about Illinois is rated 51st out of 50? And tell me a little bit about that if you would.
51st out of 50 in providing services to the development of disabled. 2008 HHS, Department of Health and Human Services study that ranked the states.
What typical services do you want that we're failing?
Well, it could be, there's a range of services. It could be anything from like a home health care worker provision to access to group homes, available spaces in group homes. There's a range of services. I don't remember them all offhand.
So in Illinois, they budget for this, they just don't do it, or they don't budget for it, they're providing.
Well, it's a combination. If you remember last year, at the end of the last General Assembly, when Senate Republicans had proposed cutting $2 billion more in spending than the governor wanted, or frankly even House Republicans wanted, Pat Quinn came out and he said, okay, these vulnerable populations, the disabled, if you do that budget, they get it, right? The most cynical, craven, despicable way a human being to do something like that. And so what you've had is social service providers that don't get paid. They haven't gotten paid for a long time, so bills stack up, they go away. So now there's less services available, period, because there's less service providers who relied at least on some portion of our budget from government. And then you have a DHS that doesn't really have the capacity to backfill those services at the community level. So you have, and so that just spirals. That's what's going to happen, that spiral. So it's a combination of budgeting, including fraud and Medicaid program, which is increasing at an annual rate that we cannot finance. And it's a combination of just not being very smart about how we're going to provide services to those populations in the state, and do so in a way like you're having a conversation happening at the national level, where they talk about block granting Medicaid to the states because they're closer to the people. You're Catholic, you believe in subsidiarity. You're closer to the people. You want government closer to the people administering those services because they have a better handle on where the services are actually needed and how to maximize that last marginal dollar. Well, that's the same thing with Medicaid and the funds available through DHS in Illinois. Is they're not making it down to social service providers who are going unpaid for services rendered or who are otherwise not getting any funding to provide said services at the community level. So it becomes centralized and bottlenecked in DHS, which doesn't have the real capacity to provide those services anyway. When I ran for governor in 2010, one of the big fights, and it wasn't even covered that much, but Pat Quinn was spending his time allowing SCIU to try and unionize home health care workers. right? Unionized home health care workers, which, by the way, in most of these families, the home health care worker is the parent. So you're gonna insert SEIU between parent and child. So the parent is going to lodge a grievance with SEIU against their child?
Yes,
I mean, it's just nonsense. But this is what you spend time doing, and there's a cost to that, an opportunity cost as well as an actual monetary cost. And this is why you have distortions in the system and services not being provided where they should.